If you'd like to turn your Bibles to the first chapter of Daniel, I'd like to read verses 1 through 7. This is our first lecture in the prophecies of Daniel. And this lecture is an appropriate question: who is Daniel? Who is Daniel? If you have been raised in church or gone to Sunday school, you know about Daniel in the lion's den. If you have been around church any length of time, you have heard some of the passages in the book of Daniel referred to in lessons and sermons and Sunday school, things of that nature. But most of the time we just do not spend a lot of time looking at the prophecies of Daniel, because there's a lot of misinformation in the religious world about these prophecies. We understand generally what they cover, but it's interesting that people see some things in these prophecies that are not there. And as we go through these lessons, we will try to clarify those things and help us to come to an understanding of what the meaning of each of these prophecies are. As we get into these prophecies, each one is a little more complicated than the one before it. So by the time we get towards the end of this study, we will be digging some pretty deep holes and unearthing some information that perhaps most people are not really aware of. It's all there in the history books, and even in the time that I was in high school, in college, when studying ancient history, these things that were revealed in Daniel were being taught as historical facts about the various empires and the wars and things of that nature that were there. So in one sense, there's nothing mysterious about the book of Daniel to us looking back. Now, to Daniel's time, it was something mysterious looking forward. So we are interested in studying these things and excited about digging out these facts. Tonight again, Daniel, the first chapter, reading starting at verse 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, and who had ability to serve the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies, and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. Stop there. There's more information in the first chapter that we'll touch on. But here we see that Daniel and his friends were transported from Judea or Judah into Babylon as captives, and they were trained to serve in the government of King Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 1, we see Daniel's story beginning. And this happens to be in the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, which is indicated to be 606 BC. The actual year could have been anywhere from 607 BC to 605 BC. The discrepancies have more to do with the difference between the ways the Hebrews and the Babylonians reckoned their time. Also, historians sometimes differ, choosing one or the other system of dating, and that's why you'll see some discrepancies. And as we go through these prophecies where dates are involved, there will be some differences in dates, but it doesn't change the truth of anything that is to be discovered in these prophecies. Now, according to the historian James Ussher, this date, 606 BC, was the 369th year after the division of Israel. You remember where Jeroboam formed the 10 tribes, the northern tribes, into the nation of Israel, leaving Rehoboam with the tribes of Benjamin and Judah to form the nation of Judah. And you'll recall that Rehoboam was the son of Solomon. So 369 years after the division of Israel, this event, the invasion of Judah by Babylon, took place. We do not know in what year Daniel was born, and we do not know his actual age when he was taken captive to Babylon. We do know that he was a Judean. He was from the tribe of Judah, and that he was born in Judah, and that he was one of the captives taken from Judah to Babylon. He is included among the young men mentioned in verse 4 that were singled out for government service. So we can conclude that he was either in his late teens or in his early 20s. He was a young man. The Babylonian invasion mentioned in verse 1 was the first of 4 invasions of Judah by Babylon. And with each invasion, some of the people were taken captive, and some of the temple vessels were taken to Babylon. It wasn't done all at one time, but over a period of several years. 606 BC, when Jehoiakim was king of Judah, that was the first invasion by Babylon. And this was the time in which Daniel was included in the captivity that was taken away. The next invasion happened in 597 BC, when Jehoiachin, the brother of Jehoiakim, was king. The next invasion was in 586 BC, when Zedekiah was the king. And it was at this time that Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. And then Jeremiah the prophet, in chapter 52, verse 30 of his book, lets us know that there was a 4th invasion that took place 5 years after the fall of Jerusalem, and that would have been in 581 BC. It's interesting that these invasions were repetitive. Usually when a foreign nation wants to destroy another nation, they just go in and they wipe it out. But that was not the case in the invasions by Nebuchadnezzar. And these repeated invasions suggest that Nebuchadnezzar probably did not intend to completely overthrow the Hebrew nation, but instead he intended to keep it in tribute to him, to make it part of his empire and make it feed into his treasuries. The Babylonian Empire extended itself in doing this. They would conquer nations, but would not necessarily destroy them, but put them under tribute, so that the wealth of those nations would flow to the king's treasury in Babylon. But with the Hebrews, it was their constant rebellion that led Nebuchadnezzar to repeatedly invade and eventually subdue the nation. And their continued rebellion is what ultimately led to the destruction of both Jerusalem and the temple of God. If they would have been content to pay tribute to Babylon, there probably would have been no destruction of Israel, probably no destruction of the temple. But knowing the history of the Israelites up to this time, They were so given over to disobedience to God, of abandoning the law of Moses and to idolatry, that God really had no other real choice. God had sent prophet after prophet after prophet to turn the Israelites around. But they stoned the prophets. They killed the prophets. They ignored the prophets. They would not repent. They would not turn their hearts to God. And so it left God no alternative but to bring punishment on Israel through the Babylonian Empire. Now, the personality and faith of Daniel are clearly seen throughout the book of Daniel. Our introduction to this young man shows him to be highly intelligent. He was smart. He was a gifted person. And it is possible that he was of royal or noble birth, but that cannot be ascertained for sure, as verse 3 lists 3 classes of young men that were brought into the service of the king. First, it says the children of Israel, which means anyone from Israel. And then it mentions the king's descendants and the nobles. And since Daniel was not really brought into the history at this point in time, his name's not mentioned, we don't know which group he was in. But it's highly possible that because of his intelligence, because of his educational background, he is more than likely a descendant of the king or one of the nobles of the land of Israel. Now, verse 4 does show him to be a young man with some outstanding characteristics. The first thing that's mentioned is that he has no blemishes. These are the qualifications that the king put out. Look over these young men coming in from Judah and find people with these characteristics, because I want to train them to be used in the government. And the first qualification, first characteristic, was no blemish. They had to have no physical defects. They're to be sound in body. They couldn't be limp. They couldn't have a twisted arm. They had to be physically fit, no blemish. And they had to be good looking. The Authorized Version says well-favored. Why did they have to be good looking? Was the king interested in just having beautiful guys standing around him all day long? No, that wasn't necessarily so. You see, the understanding at this time was that being handsome was believed to be an indicator of resourcefulness and good personality. That a handsome person had a favorable disposition on life. This was a kind of a person you wanted to be around. They were somehow above the common-looking people. And don't we still kind of think that today? See somebody that's really handsome, beautiful, and we think, oh my goodness, that's an unusual person out there. They must be somebody that I want to know. So we really haven't changed too much in all these thousands of years, have we? But had to be good looking. They had to be gifted in all wisdom. That means to be intelligent. They had to be recognized as what we would call nowadays gifted and talented. And this is an attribute that would have been recognizable both by his own countrymen as well as the Babylonians. The Hebrews that were brought into captivity would recognize that Daniel was a person gifted in all wisdom. He wasn't a smart aleck. He wasn't just somebody that knew some facts and figures about things, but he was smart. And he had an ability to learn. So this is a very special kind of person. Physically fit, good looking, and gifted in all wisdom, an intelligent person. And the next thing was possessing knowledge. Possessing knowledge. This means that he was already an educated person, and educated to such a degree that it was only natural for him to go on to an advanced education. So that suggests that Daniel and his friends were at least graduated from what we would call high school. High school back in the days when, we graduated from high school, where a high school education meant something. I can remember working for some companies and people thinking that I had a master's degree when I had only graduated from high school. That shows you how good the high schools in Wyoming were back in the middle 60s. We got an education. We learned not just facts and figures, but we learned how to think and how to discriminate. Well, Daniel was a person who was educated, and he's one of those people that got a good grade on the SAT or the ACT, a high grade, and was a natural to go on to a higher education. And also, he was quick to understand. And the Authorized Version has something different there, but it means exactly the same thing. The Authorized Version says, understanding science. Understanding science. Now, this is not to be understood the science as the Chaldeans would have understood science to be. It was not astronomy. It was not chemistry and mathematics. As the Hebrews understood science, this was music, architecture, morals, theology, and the ability to understand future events. Now, this was important for King Nebuchadnezzar to find people with quick understanding. And the Hebrews were noted for their ability to look into the future, to understand future events, because they had a history of prophets. Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, who wrote books. And these books, this information would naturally have flown to the Babylonians. And the Chaldeans would have seen that these Hebrews have perceptions that we do not have. And the king certainly needed people who were perceptive. People who could look at events and pretty well determine what future events were going to flow out of these events. If you were a king, if you were a politician, you wanted yourself surrounded with people like this. Because as you waged war, and as you engaged in commerce and political activity, you wanted somebody that could advise you on what's going to happen if I make this decision, and what could happen if I make that decision. So important to have people who were quick to understand. And it goes on to say that these people, these young men, had to have an ability to serve in the king's palace. Now, what in the world does that mean? An ability to serve in the king's palace. Well, it means they had to have physical and mental stamina that was needed to attend to the demands of extended service required by the king. These guys needed to be able to spend days in the Situation Room, poring over facts, looking over information, reports that are coming in, and be able to spend hours upon hours going over and meditating and thinking and interpreting what's going on. Kind of like, the CIA in the United States here, to give you a modern, for instance here. These were to be analysts, people that had the ability to look at these things. And they needed to have the physical and mental stamina to be able to spend hours upon hours in doing this, being ready at any moment to give a report to the king and to have it make sense to him when he asked for it. And then it says they had to have facility for language. These young men were going to learn language taught to them by the Chaldeans. And they had to have the ability to learn language. There are some people who just have a natural ability to learn languages. It just really impresses me when I meet a person and they can speak 5 different languages fluently. I am impressed, especially when some of those languages are difficult for us who were raised speaking English. Now, believe it or not, English is a very difficult language to learn because our language is full of exceptions. Whereas most other languages, while they do have exceptions, don't have that many exceptions. I remembered in high school studying Latin. It was pretty straightforward. You had the different declensions and conjugations and things of that nature. The endings of the words were changed by declension or conjugation and things like that, but you learned to recognize them. And in Latin, there were some exceptions, but not a language full of exceptions. English is full of exceptions. Ask any person who is foreign born and has had to learn English. It is a difficult language to understand, to learn. Why? Because English is not a natural language. It is a language that has been put together out of bits and pieces of all kinds of other languages. Latin, German, French, you name it. It's all mixed up and put in a big blender. And somehow that's what we speak and that's what we understand and that's the language we think in. But Daniel and his friends had to have an ability to learn languages. They were naturally speaking Hebrew. Now they were in Babylon. And they needed to learn to speak the Chaldean language. Whatever that was, Aramaic or something like that. Excuse me for not having researched that little fact. But they had to learn that language because they had to stand before the king and speak in his language, in the educated language of the day. And then there were other nations that had been conquered. And there were all kinds of different peoples living in Babylonia and having their own languages. And these young men, had to have the ability to recognize and learn to speak these languages. But in particular, and this is the point more than just learning languages, they had to have an ability to write. They had to be able to write. And that doesn't mean they just had to know their ABCs and know how to spell cat and dog and house and mom and dad. They had to be able to write intelligibly. They had to be able to write reports that were useful politically and reports that would be stored for history. They had to be accurate. They had to be understandable. They had to be precise. It was a very formal style of writing that these young men had to learn. It amazes me today how poorly Americans write. I have hired people with college degrees who could not write a paragraph that you could understand. And you write one that is understandable, and they couldn't understand it. Now that is a shame. And it doesn't reflect well on our system of education. If these young people were taught correctly, they would write correctly. They would understand English. I don't know, do they even teach English literature in high school anymore? Do they read Dickens and people like that? Do they read the formal writings of George Fenimore Cooper and people like that? Or is that just something that we have overlooked and figure that they can do well? I understand now that in schools they aren't even teaching cursive writing. You know what cursive writing is? It's where your letters are all joined together. And it's just considered acceptable to be able to print. And so you have young people in high school who cannot write nor read cursive writing. I know a lady at work. She's in her mid-40s. She has a son in high school. And she was surprised when she found out he could not read cursive writing. And he's a sophomore in high school. These men had to be able to write. Writing that was going to endure for thousands and thousands of years. In fact, historians are now looking back on some of the writings that people back in this time did and deciphering it and learning a lot about the history and the times in which Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar lived. Verse 5 tells us the young men selected, of which Daniel was one, were sent to school for 3 years. I liken this to a master's degree. And after completing their schooling, they were then to enter the service of the king. There were many Hebrew young men selected for this program, but 4 are singled out in the book of Daniel. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We are aware that the Hebrews were devout as a nation. That is, they were the chosen people of God. But that does not mean that all Hebrews were consecrated worshipers of God. If they had been, they would not have been in Babylonian captivity. It was their disobedience to God that got them in trouble, that God could no longer deliver them from. But nevertheless, they were a devout and religious people as a nation. It is coincidental that the names of these 4 young men give us a clue as to their personal relationship with God, and these names also foreshadow some of the miraculous events in which they would participate as recorded in the book of Daniel. Now, the ending E-L on the names of Daniel and Mishael represents the Hebrew word for God, El. Daniel means God is my judge. That's what his name means. Mishael means he who comes from God. Was it a mere chance, a mere accident that their parents gave them these names, showing a relationship and affinity for God? God is my judge, he who comes from God. I rather suspect that their parents may have been sincere worshipers of God to give them these names. If not, it was still among the Hebrews accustomed to do that. The AH ending on the names of Hananiah and Azariah represents the Hebrew word Yah, J-A-H in English, the shortened form of the Hebrew name for God, Yahweh. In our English Bibles, this Yahweh, Yah, is translated by the word Lord. And in the Old Testament, you'll see that word in all capital letters. Wherever you see that in the Old Testament, Lord, it is the Hebrew word Yahweh, which some versions of our English Bibles translated Jehovah. Hananiah, his name means the Lord has been gracious to me. Boy, what a name. Hi, how do you do? My name is the Lord has been gracious to me. What a testimony. What a testimony. Azariah, his name means the Lord is my helper. Wow, what a beautiful testimony. Hi, My name is the Lord is my helper. Would you like to have that name? It was customary for rulers to impose new names on their slaves. And it seems that the chief of the eunuchs selected names that in his mind corresponded to the religious character of these four young men. Daniel, remember his name is God is my judge. He called Belteshazzar, which means the treasure of Bel, B-E-L, Bel, or the depository of the secrets of Bel. Bel was the chief god among the Babylonians. And so in this eunuch's mind, he saw this young man Daniel, and there was just something special about him. He had a divine touch on his life. He seemed to have deep perceptions about reality and things that could only come from the spirit world. So in his mind, he associated this as being the depository of the secrets of Bel. That's quite an honor to be given that name, Belteshazzar. Hananiah, remember his name is the Lord has been gracious to me. He called Shadrach. And the name Shadrach means the inspiration of the sun. The inspiration of the sun. Or let God preserve us from evil. What do you suppose the character of this man's life was? He was someone that God had been gracious to. And the eunuch says that God has preserved him from evil. What a testimony in these names. Mishael, he who comes from God. The eunuch gave the name Meshach, which means he who belongs to the goddess Shishak. He who belongs to the goddess Shishak. What is the connection here? The eunuch saw Mishael as someone who was favored by God. Remember, his name means he who comes from God. So he was favored by God, Meshach. And then there is Azariah. Remember his name, the Lord is my helper. Him he called Abednego, meaning the servant of Nego. And Nego is a name given to a Babylonian deity. And it could either be the sun, Venus, or Saturn. And the thought behind this name is someone who serves God. He saw Azariah, the Lord is my helper. And he saw him as a young man who serves God. So what a testimony these four young men had when taken into college and given Babylonian names by this chief of the eunuchs. Names that maybe he didn't understand what their Hebrew names meant, but names that he gave them because he saw these qualities, these characteristics in the lives of these young men. These men were truly worshipers of God. They were men blessed by God. And he acknowledged that fact in giving them these names. That these young men were faithful to Jehovah God in practice, not just in words, is shown by the very first conflict between their faith and the rules of Babylonian society. So here they are, late teens, early 20s, having been taken away from their homes, not sure of what's going to happen to them. And they are given this tremendous opportunity to be educated and to be given a place in the king's court. But in order to do that, they have to compromise their faith. How many young people today are selling themselves short selling God short, to compromise the faith they had when they were growing up at home and in their churches. And then they go off to college, and some professor talks them out of their Christian faith. That's sad. That is sad. But here are 4 young men who would not be shaken. I didn't say could not be shaken. I said would not be shaken. They determined that they were going to stand true to God, regardless of what the rules were in this pagan society. Now in verses 8 through 10, Daniel's name is mentioned alone. The other 3 men are not mentioned. But if you look at verse 11, you see that all 4 of these young men were involved in this conflict. And the situation was this: the royal diet provided for the students of this university violated the dietary restrictions of the law of Moses. They were given to eat of the king's delicacy. Well, I mean, this was something that made them really privileged. To eat the same food that the king ate, to drink his wine. That meant that they were special. None of the other Babylonians got to do this. These young men at the University of Babylon here were given this royal diet. But when these 4 young men saw what was on the menu, they said, "Hey guys, we can't eat this because it violates the law of Moses. There are some things in the law of Moses we can't eat. Hey, we can't eat this swine's flesh. We can't eat these certain things here and stay true to God." So, Daniel requested that they be allowed to follow their dietary rules instead of eating the king's food. The chief of the eunuchs was somewhat reluctant to do this, for fear that their health would deteriorate. Guys, we're giving this sumptuous food to build you up. And if you don't eat this food, I'm afraid that you're going to lose weight, you're going to get gaunt in your beautiful faces, you're going to get sickly. And the thing that he feared more than anything else is if that did happen, he was going to be held accountable. And kings did not take nicely to their servants violating their rules. So if Daniel and his 3 friends didn't eat the king's food and they lost weight and they got sickly, this eunuch was going to lose his head. And he did not want to do that. But I appreciate Daniel as a young person here. The scripture says that he requested. And there's the key word. First of all, before he requested anything, he purposed in his heart. He had a heartfelt faith and conviction that he could not and would not compromise the law of God. I believe he had the attitude that they can kill me if they want to. I will not break God's law. And even though he was determined to hold to his principles, he approached this eunuch diplomatically. This shows some maturity for a young man. Okay? He did not confront the man. He did not shake his fist in the man's face and said, "Hey, I'm a Hebrew. I can't eat this slop. I'm no pagan." You know, there's some people, they think that's a Christian testimony, to get up and shake their fist in somebody's face. Tell them that they're pagans and insult them and so forth like this. No, Daniel was diplomatic and he requested, even though he was firm in his conviction, he was determined what he was going to do. So instead of sparking a fight with this man, he offered a short test, to which the eunuch and his chief steward agreed. And this test was 10 days of eating vegetables and drinking water, and not the king's food. And I could see the eunuch and his steward kind of getting in a little huddle, and saying, well, 10 days, that's not too long. I don't think it would completely undermine their health for 10 days. We might see some change in them, and we can point it out to them and say, hey guys, this is not working. You need to get on the king's diet. So it was a good diplomatic move. It was a reasonable test for Daniel to put before these two men. That shows respect for their position. That shows respect that he was not wanting them to get in trouble with their boss. Also shows faith that they could go through this 10 days and they would not be any worse than what they were at the moment. And in all probability, they would be stronger and healthier. Which verse 15 does say. And at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Did you hear that? They ate vegetables and drank water for 10 days. Well, these other young men in this program, some of them Hebrews, probably most of them Hebrews, ate the king's food. And after only 10 days, they looked healthier. They gained weight in a good way, more so than the other men. And it proved a point that obedience to God always pays off. God's way is always the best way. And God honored the faithfulness of Daniel and his 4 friends. In verse 17, it says, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. They went to college. And because they stayed true to God, God blessed them. And these 4 young men graduated at the top of their class. I can imagine they had a perfect 4.0 average for all 3 years. God blessed them. God blessed them. God blessed them. And young people going to college, live for God, hold to the truth, be what God desires you to be, and you apply yourself, and God will help you to learn. You may not end up with a 4.0, you may graduate with a 3.85. But God will bless you. Or you might graduate with a 2.9. But God will bless you. You will graduate. And you will have learned something that will help you in your life and the occupation that God gives to you. So at the end of their 3 years in college, they were interviewed by the king. By the king. Okay? And it is said in verse 19 that among them all, and that word all means all the young men that had been put into this program. I have no idea how many young men went into this program. It may have been 25, it may have been 50, it may have been 100, it may be 300. I don't know. The Bible doesn't say. But he says, among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they served before the king. They graduated with honors, and they were chosen to serve before the king. We don't know what happened to the other young men that went to this school who did not do as well. They had perhaps lower positions within the government, and some may have been just rejected You can't be a civil servant. You just didn't do as well. And turned out into Babylonian society to fend for themselves. We don't know. But among them all, because they stood to their principles, because they obeyed God, God blessed them and prospered them. So, my friends, this gives us an idea of who Daniel was and how he came to the position in the government where God could use him in an unusual way to add to all his other qualifications. What sets Daniel apart from all others in the king's service was a unique gift God had given him. In verse 17 it says, "And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams." That speaks well for him, that God would bless him in that way. God would use him in that unique way, because that brought him into close relationship with King Nebuchadnezzar. It brought him into close relationship with the other kings that followed Nebuchadnezzar. And when Babylon was overthrown by the Medes and the Persians, it brought him into a close relationship with the king of Persia. So this sets the background for the book of Daniel, gives us some understanding of who this young man was. Now, as we go through time in the book of Daniel, Daniel ages. The events, the prophecies recorded in the book of Daniel didn't happen overnight. They didn't all happen in 1 year. They happened over his entire lifetime. So the book of Daniel is condensed into 12 chapters. And the various prophecies that are pertinent to the Word of God are contained in those 12 chapters. And that's what we are going to study. That's what we're going to dig into. And we're going to see that God gave this man Daniel some unusual insight to events that were going to happen in the foreseeable future of not only Daniel's life, but the life of the nation of Israel. These prophecies, while they involve empires, have to do with how Israel goes through those various empires and what those empires did to the nation of Israel. So we thank God for this man Daniel. Isn't there a song, "Dare to be a Daniel"? What an example to us. So may God bless us as we study these prophecies of Daniel. Amen.